Hey y'all, Sela the Poet again, Deconstruction blog part 3. So I continue to do my research and just try to think about the state that we are in and just the deconstructing of this white European nationalist version of Christianity that many of us were taught. Okay? So a lot of European colonists, right, back in the day taught their Christian slaves the European version of Christianity, okay? And in order to practice that Christianity, Africans had to give up their hairstyles, the way that they dressed, their history, their language, their culture, and they had to take on European style of dress, European languages, European culture in order to be deemed Christian. Okay? And when you look at how some of the people operate today, like unfortunately, even in some black Christian churches, you can see the colonial influence on how some of these people act and just the mindsets, of how they are, especially when it comes to politics, especially if they're conservative. Okay. So missionary societies and associations preached to slaves on plantations. Okay. And it was the European version of Christianity. Now, even those at the time where they did have churches that were black churches, because some white churches didn't allow black people into their churches. So they had their own churches, but the powers that be still curbed the independence of black churches. There were still certain things that they couldn't do. There were certain things that were outlawed. They had to have a white monitor in some of these churches. Okay. So what ended up happening was black people, or should I say black Christians, came up with their own worship styles. Okay, they would go to something called hush harbors, which would be in the woods, and they would meet secretly in the gullies and the thickets and the ravines and the swamps, and they would have true heartfelt worship, and they would have deliverance sessions, okay, and they would have testimony meetings. They would sing Negro spirituals. And these are the things that I found out about, African American churches. Another thing is that because we're so colonized here with white Christian nationalism, right, or white European Christianity and their values, there are some things that we don't even know about African contextualism or African theology. And I started studying African theology just for that reason. Okay? So these are some things that I found out in my research. Okay? That African people see Jesus as a life giver. Okay? With a special reference to the image of healer, because traditional healers in African society have a they have a special place in society where they're called upon a lot to heal diseases and heal the sick. And so Jesus is contextually looked at as a life giver. Jesus is also seen as a mediator, okay? And that would be the image as an ancestor, okay? So some African peoples, they do seek ancestors, oracles when it comes to, finding out counsel, or they look to the elders of the community. Jesus as a loved one, okay? The focus on the image of family and friendship, and Jesus as a leader, okay? Focusing on the images of king, chief, and liberator. So, in African society, there are tribal leaders and there are chieftains, in certain regions. And Jesus is looked at contextually in that sense. Okay. I'm going to continue to let you know what else I learned, because I love learning about African theology. Okay, so Osafo Yesu, okay, is a name that sometimes Jesus is called for the one who heals. Osebin, okay, means the conquering king, okay, that leads into battle. Ogiefo is one who rescues you from danger and disease. And Odusini, okay, is a term for traditional healer of body and soul. And so they see Jesus as the great physician, okay, the healer par excellence, okay. They also see Jesus as the new proto-ancestor, okay, who gives people life in all areas, not only in biological life, okay. So African theology, and then looking at things in an African context, is very, very interesting, and I feel much more connected to that than to the European Christianity that I was taught that has racist history behind it, okay? I also learned that because of the racism and because of the dehumanization of a lot of African Christians and the colonizers and the slave masters that were, outlawing certain things and just trying to strip away African people's heritage and everything, that people began to resist that, and they formed AICs, which are African independent churches. So basically, because they were being dehumanized and they were dealing with racism and all of these, horrific oppressions within religious institutions, they basically had to form their own. And the churches that they did form, they ended up, bringing back the humanity of African peoples by allowing people to dress in their traditional dress, to worship in their traditional languages, and to, look at the Bible from an African worldview, an African context, okay? And more power to these churches. I'm going to try to do a live on some of the churches that I found out about. But if you want to ever look up AICs in Africa, African independent churches, there are a lot of them. But look them up, because a lot of them were leaders in, civil rights movements and movements for liberation within Africa. Okay? And that's going to be my deconstruction blog for now. I will post more content later. Okay? I hope that you guys have a great up and coming week. And please, 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 please continue to do your research. Continue to use critical thinking. We are in a society where people look at media and social media as gospel. You can't do that. There's a lot of misinformation. Anybody can get on and say anything, but you have to look at the truth, okay? And make sure that your sources are qualified. All right? So have a great week, guys, okay? And keep the faith, keep your head up, okay? And stay informed. Stay woke. Peace.